I used to believe that holiness was something you could breathe in if you stayed long enough inside a church. That the incense and the hymns and the soft echo of footsteps on the marble floor could somehow wash away the noise of the world. For most of my life, that's where I found peace. In that little church on the hill, with its cracked wooden pews and its windows painted with saints that seemed to follow you with their eyes. My name is Sarah. I was 22 when this story began. Young enough to believe that goodness could protect me from heartbreak, but old enough to have already been broken once or twice. Every Sunday morning, I sang in the choir. I didn't play any instruments. My voice was the only thing I had to give, and even that I never thought was special. But whenever I sang, I felt something beyond myself, something sacred that rose like light through my chest and escaped into the world. I remember the way the church smelled before Mass, a mixture of candles, old hymn books, and lilies left from the last funeral. The old organ creaked when it started up, and sometimes the microphone crackled when the priest spoke. But I loved it all. Every imperfection felt human, like God was meeting us halfway. Faith wasn't something I talked about much outside those walls. The world had no patience for devotion, especially not from someone my age. But for me, being in church wasn't about religion alone. It was about belonging. It was the only place where silence didn't feel lonely. At that time, I was dating Ed, my first real love. He wasn't what anyone would call religious. He believed in God, I think, in his own rough-edged way, but he had little use for sermons or saints. He worked long hours during the week, and on weekends, he liked his beer, his cards, and his friends. He said I made him feel calm, that I was his little angel. But sometimes he said it with a smirk, like he meant it and mocked it at the same time. We fought often. He said I spent too much time with the holy crowd. I said he spent too much time in bars. He said I didn't know how to have fun. I said I didn't find fun in losing myself. Still, I loved him. The way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the room, made my heart forget every argument. I think I loved him because he was everything I wasn't: impulsive, confident, alive in a way that burned. And maybe I wanted to be near that fire, even if I knew I could get burned. Sometimes I'd go home after one of our fights and kneel beside my bed, asking God to make us understand each other. I'd pray, not for him to change, but for me to love him better, to see what he saw in both of us. But no matter how much I prayed, our differences stayed. He called me the church girl, sometimes tenderly, sometimes cruelly. And every time, that name cut a little deeper. One night, after a particularly bitter fight, he said something I'll never forget. "Maybe you should just marry the church, Sarah. You love it more than you'll ever love me." Then he left, just like that. No apology, no backward glance. For days, I walked around like someone had turned down the volume of the world. I went through the motions: choir practice, prayer meetings, the Sunday Mass. But inside, I was hollow. Everyone noticed. Even Father Nelson, our parish priest, asked if I was all right. I lied and said yes. I always did. I was too proud to admit how much it hurt to be left behind by someone who never fully wanted to hold me. And yet, despite everything, I still loved Ed. Love doesn't just end when someone walks away. It lingers like perfume, like a song that won't stop playing in your head. My mother told me I deserved better. She said I should find someone who shared my faith, who prayed beside me instead of drinking away his nights. But the heart doesn't listen to logic. It listens to memory. And my memories of Ed were still warm. That's why I threw myself deeper into the church, into the choir, the meetings, the small good things that filled my days with purpose. If I couldn't be happy, I could at least be useful. And that's where Luis came in. He was the deacon who worked with Father Nelson. Everyone loved him. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, who asked about your mother when she was sick, who carried boxes heavier than his age should have allowed. He had this quiet authority, a way of speaking that made even doubt sound like a prayer. At first, I saw him as a figure of faith, someone above temptation, above the mess of human frailty. But little did I know, he was human too. He noticed my sadness before anyone else did. "Sarah," he said one evening after choir, "you've lost your smile. What happened?" I shrugged. "It's nothing. Just life." He smiled back. "Sometimes life needs a witness, someone to listen." That simple kindness, the offer to listen, felt like sunlight through a stained glass window. I didn't realize then how dangerous comfort can be when your heart is still bleeding. But that was the beginning of the friendship that would one day blur into something else, something I'd spend years repenting. Back then, I thought I was safe, surrounded by faith, guided by good intentions, living close to God. I had no idea that even angels can fall, and that sometimes the songs you sing for heaven can echo in hell. Sometimes love doesn't feel like a blessing. Sometimes it feels like a test, one designed by God Himself to measure how much pain a heart can hold before it breaks. That's how it was with me and Ed. We had been together for almost 2 years. In the beginning, everything was light and laughter. He used to pick me up after choir practice, waiting in his old truck with music blasting from the radio. He'd bring me flowers, not the perfect kind from a store, but wild ones he picked by the road. I used to press them inside my Bible, thinking that somehow this too was sacred. But somewhere along the way, the light started to fade. Our differences, the ones that once felt charming, began to hurt. He loved nights out. I loved quiet evenings. He believed in living for the moment. I believed in eternity. He'd tease me for being the church girl. Sometimes he meant it playfully, but other times it was a weapon. "Do you ever get tired of pretending to be perfect?" he'd ask. And I'd laugh, even when it stung, because I didn't want another fight. But the fights always came. They started small, about time, attention, the friends he kept, the way I never wanted to go dancing. Then they grew into something darker, about who we were and whether love was enough when two people walked in opposite directions. He said I was too serious, too careful, too holy. I said he didn't take anything seriously enough. Once, after he came home from a night out, smelling of alcohol and regret, I tried to tell him that I was scared of losing him, scared of the man he was becoming. He looked at me with that sharp, tired smile and said, "You know what your problem is, Sarah? You want everything to look perfect. You don't love people. You love the idea of saving them." I didn't answer, because maybe part of me knew he was right. I had spent so much time trying to fix things, to fix him, to fix us, to fix myself, that I forgot love isn't supposed to feel like penance. And yet, even when we broke apart, I couldn't let go. Every night, I found myself praying for him, not just for his happiness, but for his return. I told God, "If this love is wrong, please take it away from me." But it never left. It stayed like a splinter beneath my skin, tender and deep. Weeks passed without a word from him. I tried to convince myself it was for the best. I sang louder in church, hoping that if I filled the air with enough praise, I could drown out the silence he left behind. But no hymn could cover that emptiness. Every time I saw couples walking hand in hand after Mass, I felt a dull ache in my chest. Not jealousy, but a kind of mourning. I missed the version of us that still believed love could fix anything. Then came the day we ended for good. It was a Sunday. He came to meet me after service. I could tell from his face that it wasn't going to be another apology. He said he was tired of fighting, tired of feeling like I was judging him. "You don't see me, Sarah," he said. "You see what I should be. You don't love me. You love who you think I could become." Those words hit like a blade, because maybe he was right again. Maybe my love for him had turned into a mission, one that left both of us bleeding. I tried to hold his hand, to tell him we could fix it, that love wasn't supposed to be easy. But he pulled away. Then, with a bitter laugh, he said, "Maybe you should just stick to church. God listens better than I do." He turned and walked away. That was the last time I saw him for months. I remember walking home in silence that evening, still wearing my choir dress, still smelling faintly of incense and lilies. The sky was the color of bruised steel, and it felt like even heaven was mourning with me. At home, my mother noticed right away. "What happened?" she asked, worry creasing her face. "He left," I whispered. She sighed. "Then thank God." I looked at her, stunned. "Sarah, you need a man who walks beside you, not one who pulls you away from who you are." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't. I loved him too deeply, even in his absence. So I went back to church the next day, hoping the routine would save me. But prayer felt heavy, like words falling into an empty well. I sang, but my voice cracked. I smiled, but it wasn't real. People thought I was strong, the sweet, devoted girl who found strength in faith. If only they knew how much I doubted everything. How much I questioned why God would let me love someone I couldn't keep. That's when I began to notice Luis more, his calm presence, his kindness that never asked for anything in return. He didn't preach, he listened. He didn't quote scripture, he simply understood. He wasn't Ed, not loud, not impulsive, not cruel. And yet, somehow, he filled the space Ed left behind without even trying. Looking back now, I can see the irony. I had spent so long asking God for a sign, for a reason, for a way to heal. And when comfort finally came, I didn't realize that it too was a test. Because sometimes what looks like grace is just temptation wearing a halo. And sometimes the hardest test of faith is not losing God when love walks away, but keeping him close when something else comes to take his place. When I think of Luis now, I don't see him the way others did, standing at the altar, speaking about grace with that calm voice that made the church go still. I see him sitting beside me on an old wooden bench after choir practice, sunlight fading through the stained glass, his hands folded quietly, waiting for me to speak. That's what he was best at, waiting. He never rushed words out of me, never filled the silence just to make it more comfortable. He had a gift for stillness, a way of making space for what people couldn't say. I met him the first time I joined the church choir, long before everything happened. He was already a respected deacon, someone everyone trusted. He helped Father Nelson with baptisms, weddings, community projects, the kind of man whose presence carried both authority and gentleness. Married for over 20 years, father of 2 teenagers, he seemed like the kind of person who had mastered life. So when my world began to fall apart after Ed left, I guess I gravitated toward that calm. It wasn't a decision. It just happened. At first, our conversations were simple. He'd ask how the choir rehearsals were going, or if I needed help organizing the hymn sheets. Then gradually, he started asking about me. Not in the way people ask out of politeness, but as if he genuinely wanted to understand what was happening inside me. "Are you sleeping well, Sarah? Has your voice been okay lately? You sound tired." Little questions that made me feel seen. I remember one particular evening, a Wednesday, when the church was nearly empty. The candles on the altar were still burning from evening prayers, and I stayed behind after everyone had left, pretending to organize songbooks just so I didn't have to go home to silence. Luis walked in carrying a box of communion wine. He noticed me right away. "Long day?" he asked. I nodded. "It's been a long few weeks." He smiled gently, putting the box down. "I figured. You've been singing like someone trying to convince heaven to listen." I don't know why that line made my throat tighten. Maybe because it was true. I had been singing to fill a void that no sound could reach. He sat beside me, his hands resting on his knees. "You don't have to tell me what's wrong," he said. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." And I did talk, slowly at first, about the fights with Ed, about how it felt to be judged for my faith, about how tired I was of pretending I was fine. He listened without interrupting, nodding sometimes, his eyes kind and heavy with empathy. When I finished, he said quietly, "Pain isn't a sign of weak faith, Sarah. Sometimes it's the proof of it. You keep loving even when it hurts. That's strength." I think that was the first time in weeks I felt something other than emptiness. From then on, we talked often. After choir, before Mass, sometimes on the phone when he needed to coordinate parish events. I told myself it was all innocent, part of the work, part of the community. But underneath, something else was growing, something I didn't want to name. He made me laugh again. He made me feel light. He noticed things no one else did. The way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous, or how I always hummed the same melody when I was thinking. He was careful too. Respectful, never crossing any line. And maybe that's what made it more dangerous. His restraint made me trust him more. Once, during a late evening rehearsal, a storm began outside. The thunder shook the windows, and lightning painted the pews in flashes of silver. Everyone rushed out early, afraid the roads would flood. I stayed behind to close up, and Luis came back to help. "You shouldn't walk home in this weather," he said. "I'll drive you." I hesitated. "It's fine. I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he said. "You'd do the same for me." And he was right. I would have. The drive was quiet, the sound of rain soft against the glass. He asked about my family, about my dreams, about the music I wanted to write someday. He said my voice carried a kind of truth that couldn't be taught. "I hope you never lose that," he said. "The world needs voices that remind it of grace." I turned to look at him then, not as a deacon, not as someone older and wiser, but as a man who saw me in a way no one else ever had. When we reached my house, he waited until the rain eased a little before unlocking the doors. Neither of us moved right away. There was nothing improper in that moment, only a quiet, fragile stillness between two people who had both been lonely too long. He smiled faintly. "You're going to be fine, Sarah. You just don't see it yet." And maybe that was true. But what I didn't see then was how easily comfort can turn into dependence, how listening can become a bond, and how that bond can blur into something more. After that night, I found myself looking forward to seeing him, to hearing his voice during Mass, to catching his smile from across the choir loft. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something softer, more subtle, the way a wounded heart leans toward warmth without realizing it's already begun to fall. I told myself it was harmless, that he was simply a good man helping a broken woman find her way back to peace. But deep down, I knew I was crossing an invisible line, not with actions, but with thoughts. Sometimes sin begins not in what we do, but in what we crave in silence. And though I didn't know it then, that silence was already listening, waiting for the moment when comfort would turn into temptation. It was the kind of rain that seemed endless, heavy, persistent, and strangely intimate. It had been falling since afternoon, coating the small town in a thin silver veil. The air smelled of wet earth and candle wax. Inside the church, the echo of the storm blended with the organ's low hum, the kind of music that makes the soul ache without knowing why. That evening, the service had been quieter than usual. The storm had scared most people away. Only a handful of parishioners sat scattered among the pews, their umbrellas dripping by the doors. I sang with the choir as always, though my heart wasn't really in it. My voice rose and fell automatically, carrying hymns I'd sung 1,000 times before. When the final prayer ended, thunder rolled through the sky like God clearing his throat. The congregation hurried out into the rain, umbrellas opening like dark wings. I stayed behind to help Luis close up, something I'd done countless times before. He was stacking hymn books when I turned around. "Go on home, Sarah," he said, smiling. "You'll catch cold in this weather." "I'll wait a bit," I replied. "The rain's too strong to walk in." He looked out the window. Sheets of water blurred the view. "All right," he said finally. "I'll drive you home. I can't let my favorite singer turn into a puddle." We both laughed, lightly, easily. It was the kind of moment that felt safe, familiar, the kind that tricks you into thinking nothing could go wrong. The drive was short, 10 minutes at most, but that night it felt like an eternity folded into a single heartbeat. The world outside was gray and trembling. The windshield wipers moved rhythmically, like a metronome marking the pace of something inevitable. Inside the car, there was warmth, the faint scent of rain-soaked leather and his cologne. At first we talked about the service, about the leaky roof in the parish hall, about small things that meant nothing. But the pauses between words began to stretch. The rain grew louder. My heart did too. He glanced at me once or twice, quick, careful glances, and every time he did, something inside me stirred. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Just tired." "You've been carrying a lot," he said. "Anyone can see that." Something in his voice broke through me. It wasn't just compassion, it was understanding. He wasn't trying to fix me or fill the silence. He was just there, fully there, present in a way Ed never had been. And that was the danger. Because when someone truly sees you, even the walls you built in God's name begin to crumble. I looked out the window, pretending to watch the rain, but my reflection stared back, a woman torn between holiness and hunger, between guilt and the desperate need to feel alive again. When we reached my street, the rain was still relentless. He parked in front of my house but made no move to unlock the doors. We sat there, cocooned inside a world of storm and silence. "Maybe wait a few minutes," he said softly. "No use getting drenched." I nodded, grateful for the excuse not to move. Thunder cracked in the distance, followed by that deep, vibrating quiet that always comes right after lightning. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Luis leaned back against the seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel. "You know," he said after a moment, "it's strange. Sometimes I think God puts people in our lives at the exact moment we need them most." His voice trembled slightly, maybe from nerves, maybe from something else. I wanted to agree, to say that his presence had been a blessing, but the words wouldn't come. Because what I felt wasn't holy. It was something far more human, fragile, forbidden, and terrifyingly real. He turned toward me then, and for a brief, unbearable second, our eyes met. The air between us thickened. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven. Then, without a word, he reached out, not in confidence, not in dominance, but with a kind of helplessness that mirrored my own. His fingers brushed my cheek, tracing away a strand of wet hair. The touch was so gentle, so unintentional, that it felt like an accident. But it wasn't. I should have pulled away. I should have remembered every prayer, every vow, every reason why this was wrong. But in that instant, I wasn't a woman of faith. I was just a woman, aching to be held, aching to feel wanted again. Our lips met. It wasn't the kind of kiss born out of passion, but of loneliness. Two souls collapsing under the weight of everything they had denied. The world outside vanished. There was only the rain, our breaths, and the unbearable truth that something sacred had just been shattered. When I finally pulled away, I couldn't look at him. Shame rushed in, flooding faster than the storm outside. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I don't know what just happened." He didn't answer right away. His hand trembled on the steering wheel. "Neither do I," he said finally. His voice was low, almost broken, but I wish it hadn't. We sat there for a long time, both drenched in silence, both terrified of what we had done. When I opened the door, the rain hit my face like a punishment. He said my name, just once, as if asking for forgiveness neither of us could give. I turned back, met his eyes, and saw the same confusion, the same guilt, the same desperate need for meaning. Then I closed the door and walked toward my house, my clothes clinging to my skin, the sound of rain swallowing everything behind me. Inside, I fell to my knees. I prayed, not for forgiveness, but for understanding, for a way to undo what couldn't be undone. But there are some prayers heaven cannot answer, because the rain that night didn't just soak the ground. It washed away everything I thought I knew about who I was and what I was capable of. Guilt is a quiet creature. It doesn't roar or announce its presence. It simply waits, in the pauses, in the shadows, in the space between one breath and the next. That's how it began for me, softly, almost kindly, before it turned into a storm that lived inside my chest. After that night in the rain, nothing looked the same. The church, once my refuge, now felt like a place I had no right to enter. The hymns that used to lift my spirit now sounded like accusations. Every note, every prayer whispered the same word in my ear: sinner. I avoided everyone for days. I told my mother I wasn't feeling well, that I needed rest. I stayed in my room, curtains drawn, light off, replaying the moment again and again. That first touch, the warmth of his hand, the silence that followed. It didn't feel real, and yet it haunted me as if it had branded itself onto my soul. How could something that had felt so tender now feel so poisonous? How could a moment that had been born from comfort leave behind such desolation? I kept asking myself where it started, when compassion turned into desire, when friendship became temptation. Was it the night he made me laugh for the first time after my heartbreak? Or the way he said my name like it meant something sacred? Or was it that night in the car when two lonely hearts mistook each other for salvation? No matter how I tried to reason with it, the truth remained the same. I had crossed a line, not just with a man, but with God. The next Sunday, I couldn't bring myself to attend Mass. The thought of stepping into that church made my stomach twist. I imagined the saints painted on the glass watching me, their faces lit by morning sun, their eyes burning with silent judgment. I stayed home, pretending to be sick again, listening to the bells ring in the distance. Each toll felt like a reminder of how far I'd fallen. On Monday, I went to confession, or at least I tried. I walked to the church when it was empty, heart pounding, hoping Father Nelson would be there. He was. But when I saw him, something inside me froze. I couldn't speak. I couldn't confess what I had done. How could I? The man I had sinned with stood beside him every day, serving at the altar, reading the Word of God. Instead, I made up a lie, confessed impatience, jealousy, pride, anything but the truth. And when Father Nelson gave me absolution, I wanted to scream that it wasn't enough, that he was blessing a lie. But I stayed silent. That became my new habit: silence. I stopped singing in the choir for a while. I told them I needed to focus on my studies, that I was exhausted. Everyone accepted it. Everyone except Luis. He noticed immediately. He came to see me one afternoon, after practice. He stood at the gate, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "You haven't been coming by," he said softly. "I needed time," I replied. "It's better this way." "For who?" he asked. "For both of us," I said, though the words tasted like ash. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he might cry. Then he nodded almost reverently. "You're right," he whispered. "God forgive us, but you're right." He turned and walked away, and I felt my heart crack open all over again. After that, I didn't see him for weeks. He stopped coming by my house, stopped calling, stopped lingering after Mass. And though part of me was relieved, another part missed him so deeply it hurt to breathe. At night, I'd kneel by my bed, praying until the words lost meaning. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." It became a chant, a desperate plea. But no forgiveness came, because forgiveness requires confession, and confession requires courage. And I had neither. The guilt began to change me. It lived in my body like a sickness, heavy, unrelenting. My shoulders ached. My voice grew weaker. When people spoke to me, I'd drift away mid-conversation. My mother thought I was heartbroken over Ed again. She told me time would heal it, but time doesn't heal what festers in secret. It only deepens the wound. Every Sunday I'd hear the church bells, and every time my heart clenched. I'd imagine Luis standing at the altar, speaking about purity and grace, and I'd wonder if he felt it too, this invisible weight pressing down on us both. Did he think of me when he prayed? Did he avoid the same hymns I did because they hurt too much? Or had he buried it better than I had? Sometimes I envied him. Men are better at building walls. Women, we carry things differently, not in our hands, but in our bones. One night, the guilt grew so unbearable that I went back to the church. It was late, nearly midnight. The doors were unlocked, as they often were, for anyone seeking peace. I lit a single candle, knelt before the altar, and whispered the truth aloud for the first time. "I betrayed you," I said. My voice broke. "I betrayed myself. I betrayed everything you made me to be." The candle flickered, as if the air itself recoiled. Tears came hard and fast. I pressed my forehead against the pew and sobbed until my throat burned. When I finally looked up, I half expected lightning to strike me. But there was only silence, vast, merciful silence. That's when I realized something I've never forgotten. God doesn't always punish the sinner. Sometimes He lets you live with the memory, because that, in itself, is punishment enough. From that night on, I lived like a ghost. I went back to the choir eventually, but I sang softer, as if afraid that my own voice might betray me. Every glance from Luis felt like a confession. Every prayer, a reminder. I thought I had buried my sin deep enough that no one would ever find it. But sin has a way of breathing, of waiting until the moment you least expect it to rise again. And it would, soon. It had been almost 2 months since the night that changed everything. 2 months of silence, of pretending, of walking through days that all felt the same, gray, hollow, suspended between guilt and denial. I had convinced myself that time would heal it, that distance would dissolve what had happened. Luis had kept his distance too. We still saw each other on Sundays, of course. The church wasn't big enough to hide from one another, but we barely exchanged more than polite smiles. Every glance was a reminder of the storm we'd created and were now trying to forget. It should have been easier as weeks passed, but every time I heard his voice during Mass, something inside me trembled. Every prayer he read, every blessing he offered, reminded me of the moment he had broken his own vows and how I had let him. I wanted to hate him for it. I wanted to hate myself even more. But guilt is strange. It doesn't always come dressed as anger. Sometimes it comes as longing. I told myself that what happened had been a mistake, a single fall into weakness, something that could be buried, erased by silence and repentance. And maybe, in time, I would have believed that lie, if the past hadn't decided to come knocking again. It was a Thursday evening when it happened. I had just come home from work, the smell of rain still lingering in the air. My mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. Then the doorbell rang. When I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. Ed stood there. He looked thinner, older, and his eyes, those reckless, restless eyes, were filled with something I hadn't seen before. Regret. "Hey," he said softly. "Can I come in?" For a second I couldn't speak. All the months of silence, of waiting, of wondering if he'd ever think of me again. They all collided inside me like waves. I stepped aside, and he entered quietly, looking around the room as if expecting to find traces of his old life still there. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he said, "but I had to try." He looked so different, humbled, tired, stripped of that arrogance that used to fuel our fights. It was as if life had finally taught him the lessons I could never make him learn. "I missed you," he said, voice trembling. "I tried to forget you, Sarah. I really did. But I couldn't. I should have felt anger or caution or anything rational. But instead, I felt warmth flood through me, the kind that only comes when the person you prayed for finally reappears at your door." He talked for a long time, about how he'd realized he was wrong, how he'd been drinking too much, how the nights without me had felt empty. "I know I said things I shouldn't have," he admitted, "but I swear I never stopped loving you." Each word chipped away at the wall I had built around myself. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. When he asked for another chance, I didn't say no. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I was desperate for redemption. Or maybe, deep down, I saw his return as a way to rewrite my own story, to cover one sin with the illusion of a second chance. We started seeing each other again, slowly, cautiously. He promised to change, and for a while, it seemed like he truly had. He stopped drinking so much, spent more time at home, even came to church with me once, though he looked uncomfortable the whole time. Everyone thought it was a miracle that we had reconciled. Only I knew that miracles don't begin with lies, because the truth sat inside me like a secret I couldn't confess. Not to him, not to anyone. Every time he smiled at me, every time he said he was grateful I had forgiven him, I felt the lie grow heavier. I told myself I was doing it out of love, that it was better this way. What good would come from telling him the truth? It would destroy him. It would destroy us. And yet, at night, when I closed my eyes, I still saw Luis's face. The weight of that memory pressed on my chest until I could barely breathe. One Sunday, Ed and I attended Mass together for the first time since our reconciliation. I should have known that fate would be cruel enough to place Luis at the altar that day. When I saw him, my breath caught. He looked composed, as always, but there was something in his eyes. A flicker of pain, recognition, maybe even longing. Our eyes met for a split second before I looked away. My hands trembled. Ed, oblivious, reached over and squeezed them gently, thinking I was nervous about being there with him again. If only he knew. The choir began to sing, a song about forgiveness and divine mercy. The words cut through me like glass. Even the sinner, when he repents, finds his way back to grace. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that my repentance was enough, that my silence counted as penance. But deep down, I knew I hadn't truly faced what I'd done. That night, after Mass, I cried harder than I had in months. Ed held me, asking what was wrong. "I'm just tired," I lied. But what I really meant was, I'm tired of living with ghosts. And yet, despite everything, the guilt, the shame, the fear, I stayed with him. Because sometimes, when you've sinned so deeply, the only way to keep living is to pretend that life has forgiven you. I didn't know it then, but my lie was about to grow heavier. Life has a way of testing even the best-kept secrets, and mine was about to take form, a beating heart beneath my own, innocent of everything I'd done, and yet carrying the proof of it. But that truth was still a few weeks away. For now, I simply lay beside the man who thought I had come back pure, while the man who knew otherwise stood at the altar, blessing strangers with hands that had once held me. And that was the cruelest kind of punishment, to be forgiven by everyone except myself. I don't remember the exact day I knew, not the date, not the hour, only the feeling, that strange, quiet certainty that something inside me had changed. At first, I thought it was exhaustion, the dizziness, the nausea, the way my heart seemed to beat faster than usual. I blamed it on nerves, on the stress of pretending everything was fine. But deep down, I already knew. A woman always knows. Still, I fought the thought for days, refusing to give it a name, because the moment I did, everything would become real. When the morning sickness began, I could no longer lie to myself. I bought a test and hid it in the bathroom cabinet, waiting until my mother left for work. My hands shook so badly I could barely open the box. I remember kneeling on the cold tile floor, watching the seconds crawl by, as if God himself were dragging time just to see how much I could endure. 2 lines, clear, unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. The air around me seemed to vanish. I dropped to the floor and cried, not out of joy, not even out of fear, but out of disbelief. Because I knew with a certainty that pierced through every hope and every prayer that the child growing inside me wasn't Ed's. The memory of that night came back like lightning. The rain, the trembling silence, the warmth of Luis's skin against mine. The moment I had convinced myself was buried was now alive again, pulsing inside me. I wanted to scream, to undo it, to run until I reached a place where God couldn't see me. But guilt travels faster than feet. For 3 days, I said nothing. I went to work, smiled when people spoke, even held Ed's hand when we went out, but inside, I was hollow. Every word he said echoed through me like a confession I hadn't made. Then, one evening, while he was talking about our future, about the house he wanted to build someday, about the family he dreamed of, I nearly broke. I wanted to tell him everything. The truth sat at the edge of my tongue, trembling like a bird desperate to be free. But when he smiled, when his eyes lit up as if he finally believed we could be happy again, I couldn't do it. I couldn't take that light away from him. So I nodded. I smiled back, and in that moment, my silence became my sentence. For weeks, I lived 2 lives, one on the outside, one in the shadows. In public, I was the woman rebuilding her relationship, the one who had been given a second chance at love. In private, I was the sinner carrying the proof of her fall beneath her heart. Every night, I prayed for a miracle, that maybe the dates were wrong, that maybe I had miscalculated, that somehow the child could still be Ed's. But no matter how I twisted the truth, the numbers never changed. It was Luis. The thought of him filled me with a strange, painful contradiction. Shame, longing, anger, and pity all at once. He had no idea. And I couldn't bear to tell him. I imagined what would happen if I did. His wife's face, his children's confusion, the whispers that would spread through the parish like wildfire, the church doors that would close for both of us. I couldn't destroy him. So I decided to destroy myself instead. There were moments, dark, fleeting moments, when I thought of ending it, of erasing the evidence before it grew into something undeniable. I even made an appointment once, walking halfway there before turning back, sobbing in the street like a madwoman. But then, one night, as I lay awake with my hand over my stomach, I felt something. Not movement, not yet, but presence. And something inside me shifted. I realized that whatever this was, however it had begun, it wasn't the child's fault. He was innocent, untouched by the sin that created him. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of grace. Maybe this was my punishment, yes, but also my chance at redemption. Maybe God was giving me something pure to protect, even as I lived with the weight of my impurity. When I finally told Ed I was pregnant, his reaction broke me. He cried, actually cried. He fell to his knees, holding me, thanking God, saying it was a sign, that our love had been restored, that this was the beginning of a new chapter for us. And I let him believe it. I let him kiss my hands, my stomach, my tears. Each word of his joy pierced me like a blade. But I couldn't take it back. I couldn't ruin him again, not after everything he had already suffered because of me. From that day on, I wore my lie like armor. Every smile, every tender word, every dream we shared was built on a foundation of silence. I told myself it was an act of love, that sparing him the truth was a kind of mercy. But mercy built on deception is just another form of cruelty. And the cruelty wasn't only toward him, it was toward myself. Because every time I looked at my growing belly, I saw both life and betrayal. I loved my unborn child, but I also feared what he represented, the living proof that I had crossed the line between heaven and sin. There were moments when I'd pass Luis at church and wonder if he could sense it. Did his spirit feel what his eyes couldn't see? Did some divine whisper tell him the truth that I carried inside me? Once, during Mass, he looked at me a little longer than usual, just long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. A knowing, maybe. Or maybe it was just guilt reflected back at me. When the service ended, I slipped out quickly, pressing my hand against my stomach, as if to hide what only I knew. The secret within me grew heavier each day, not just in flesh, but in spirit. It was my penance, my burden, and strangely, my salvation. I had no idea then how far this lie would reach, how it would shape every breath, every prayer, every tear that would follow. But I knew one thing for certain. The child I carried was a miracle born of sin, a reminder that even in the darkest fall, God sometimes plants something that can still bloom. And maybe, just maybe, that was his way of saying that even sinners can still create something pure, even if they have to carry the truth alone. The day of my son's baptism was bright, impossibly so. The kind of sunlight that feels almost cruel when your heart is heavy. The church bells rang joyfully, their sound slicing through the still morning air, and people smiled as they entered the chapel dressed in their Sunday best. Everyone saw it as a day of blessing. Only I knew it was also a day of punishment. I had spent the previous night awake, watching the baby sleep beside me. He was barely 3 months old, his breath soft and even, his tiny hands opening and closing in dreams. He looked like innocence itself, untouched, unknowing. And that was what hurt the most. He deserved better than the story that brought him into the world. I whispered to him, my voice trembling, "You're the only good thing I ever did wrong." When morning came, I dressed him in white. The fabric felt too pure for my hands to touch. My mother cried softly as she helped tie the ribbon, her tears of pride a knife twisting deeper into my guilt. To her, and to everyone else, this was a miracle. The lost daughter, once broken-hearted, now a mother blessed by God. No one suspected the truth that pulsed beneath my skin. Ed was radiant that morning. He held the baby as if he were carrying redemption itself. His joy was pure, unguarded. "I still can't believe it," he said, smiling at me. "After everything we went through, God gave us him. It's like a second chance." I nodded, unable to speak. He kissed my forehead before we left the house, and I nearly broke down right there. How could I accept a love so full when my own heart was built on lies? The church was full. Friends, neighbors, family, everyone gathered to witness the sacrament. Flowers lined the altar. The air smelled of roses and candle wax. My hands were shaking as I carried my son toward the front pew, afraid that somehow the truth was visible, written on my face for everyone to read. And then I saw him. Luis, standing near the altar in his white vestments holding the holy water. He was the one who would perform the baptism. For a moment, I stopped breathing. It felt like the floor had vanished beneath me. I hadn't known. I hadn't even considered that he might be the one chosen to bless the ceremony. Life has a way of circling back at the cruelest possible moment. And that day, it completed its circle with divine precision. He looked up just as I saw him. Our eyes met across the room, and in that brief instant, the air between us thickened with everything unspoken. Recognition, guilt, sorrow, and something deeper, something that would never be forgiven by either heaven or earth. He blinked once, lowered his gaze, and turned back toward the altar. His composure didn't waver, but I knew his heart must have been pounding just like mine. The ceremony began. The priest spoke about purity, about the washing away of sin, about rebirth in the eyes of God. Every word struck me like lightning. I felt faint. My hands trembled so hard I nearly dropped the baby. Ed touched my shoulder, thinking I was just nervous. "It's all right," he whispered. "He's in good hands." I almost laughed, or screamed. In good hands. If only he knew whose hands would soon pour the water over his son's head. When Luis approached, the world seemed to narrow to a single heartbeat. He smiled faintly, the polite, distant smile of a man doing his duty. But I saw the tremor in his lips, the shadow behind his calm. He asked me to hold the child closer. I obeyed, my fingers clutching the fabric so tightly it nearly tore. "What name do you give this child?" he asked, his voice steady. "Michael," I whispered. "His name is Michael." The name felt heavy in my mouth, a name meaning who is like God. A cruel irony, considering the truth behind his birth. Luis dipped his fingers into the silver basin and lifted them slowly. Water shimmered as it dripped between his hands. Holy water, pure and cold. He leaned closer, murmuring the sacred words, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." The water touched my son's forehead, and I broke. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. Everyone thought I was moved by emotion, by the beauty of the sacrament. No one knew that I was collapsing under the weight of my secret, watching the man who had fathered my child unknowingly bless him into God's grace. It felt like both a miracle and a curse. A strange, sacred justice, as if heaven itself had chosen this moment to remind me that nothing stays hidden forever, even if no one speaks it aloud. I looked at Luis through my tears. For the briefest second, our eyes met again. There was pain there, yes, but also something else. Forgiveness, maybe, or understanding. And I knew then that he would never ask, never confront, never confess. He would carry his silence to the grave, just as I would. After the ceremony, people congratulated us. They said the baby was beautiful, that the service had been moving, that I had looked so emotional. I thanked them with a trembling smile. Each kind word felt like salt on an open wound. When we got home, Ed lifted the baby high and laughed. "Can you believe it?" he said. "Our little boy, baptized, blessed, a fresh start for all of us." And I stood there, watching him, watching the sunlight glint off our son's face, the same deep brown eyes that didn't belong to him. I smiled because I had to, but inside, I was drowning. That night, after everyone fell asleep, I sat by the crib for hours, the candlelight flickering across the walls. I ran my fingers gently across my son's tiny hand and whispered, "You don't know it yet, but you saved me." And it was true. Because though his existence had begun in sin, he had become my reason to keep living, to keep believing that God hadn't entirely turned his face from me. Maybe this was my punishment, but also my absolution. To raise a child born of guilt, yet capable of love, to find grace in the shadow of shame. As I kissed his forehead, I realized that the baptism hadn't just washed away his imagined sin. It had baptized mine too, not erased it, not forgiven it, but transformed it into something I could finally carry without collapsing. For the first time since that night in the rain, I felt a fragile peace, Not redemption, not yet, but the faint, trembling hope that one day even my sin might serve a purpose. Years passed like pages in a book I was too afraid to reread. Michael grew, and with every inch he gained, I lost a little more of my guilt, though it never truly left me. It just changed shape, softened around the edges, becoming something quieter, something I could live beside. He was a gentle boy from the start, calm, curious, kind. He had Luisha's eyes, deep brown and steady, and every time I looked into them, I saw the truth reflected back at me. It used to terrify me, that silent reminder of what I'd done. But as the years went on, the fear gave way to something else: gratitude. Because somehow, through him, I began to understand that love can still grow in the soil of sin. That even the most broken stories can give birth to something holy. When he turned 5, I took him to the church to light candles. He clasped his little hands together, eyes closed, whispering a prayer only he and God could hear. When I asked him afterward what he'd prayed for, he smiled shyly. "For you," he said, "I asked God to make you happy again." I had to look away. Tears burned behind my eyes. He was the only soul who could speak my name and make me believe I still deserved grace. Life moved on. Ed became a devoted father, proud, protective, and blind to the truth that lived under his own roof. Watching him love Michael was both beautiful and excruciating. Every time he carried our son on his shoulders or kissed his forehead goodnight, I felt a stab of guilt so sharp it almost took my breath away. But guilt, I learned, can coexist with love. Sometimes it even deepens it. I poured every ounce of myself into motherhood. I made it my penance and my purpose. I wanted to be the kind of mother who could make up for the sins of the woman I once was. And in a way, Michael gave me that chance. He had a light about him, the kind that made people stop and listen. Even as a child, he spoke with a wisdom far beyond his years. Teachers adored him, neighbors praised him, and strangers often told me he had an old soul. I used to smile politely, but inside, I wondered if maybe that was true. Maybe his soul had come from somewhere higher, sent not to punish me, but to guide me back toward the light. When he was 10, he asked me about faith for the first time. "Mom," he said, sitting beside me on the porch one summer night, "how do you know God forgives people?" I froze. The question hit me like a confession I hadn't expected to make. "I don't always know," I admitted. "Sometimes I just have to believe he does." He frowned thoughtfully. "Even when you do something really bad?" "Yes," I whispered. "Even then." He nodded slowly, as if that answer settled something deep inside him. Then he leaned his head against my shoulder, and in that simple gesture, I felt the closest thing to absolution I'd ever known. By then, Luis had moved away. His family relocated to another town when his wife fell ill. The news reached me through the parish bulletin. I never saw him again. Part of me was relieved. The other part grieved quietly. I sometimes wondered if he ever suspected the truth, if he ever looked at his own children and saw echoes of Michael's smile, his posture, the tilt of his head. But those thoughts were dangerous, so I buried them. Luis belonged to the part of my life that had been consumed by silence. Michael belonged to the part that still had a chance to bloom. Years rolled on, each one layering over the last like soft sediment, dulling the pain, but never erasing it. By the time Michael turned 16, he was taller than me, strong, compassionate, the kind of young man who helped strangers on the street, who defended his friends, who stayed after class to help teachers clean up. And every time I looked at him, I saw proof that God can take even the worst mistake and turn it into something that blesses the world. One afternoon, I found him in the living room reading an old Bible, the one I hadn't touched in years. He looked up at me with that familiar curiosity. "Mom," he said, "why did you stop singing in church?" I hesitated. "Life got busy, I suppose." He tilted his head. "But you still hum when you cook. You sound happy when you sing." That made me laugh. "Do I?" "Yes," he said. "I think when you sing, God listens." Something about the innocence in his voice undid me. That night, I opened the Bible for the first time in over a decade. Inside, pressed between its pages, I found a dried wildflower. One Ed had given me years ago, back when life was still simple. It was faded and fragile, but it was still there, just like me. The next Sunday, for reasons I still can't explain, I went back to the church. I stood at the back, holding Michael's hand as the choir began to sing. The melody rose, familiar and haunting. I hadn't heard it since before that night, the one when rain had blurred the lines between devotion and desire. And as the music filled the air, something inside me finally shifted. The guilt didn't vanish. It never would. But it softened, transforming into something like acceptance. I realized that maybe God hadn't turned away from me all those years ago. Maybe he had stayed, quietly, patiently, waiting for me to find my way back, not through penance, but through love. Michael squeezed my hand and looked up at me with those deep, unknowing eyes that once mirrored my sin and now reflected only grace. And I knew in that instant that he had been my redemption all along. Not by washing away my guilt, but by giving it purpose, by teaching me that even the most flawed love can create something holy. When we left the church that day, sunlight broke through the stained glass, scattering colors across the floor: crimson, gold, sapphire. Michael turned to me and said, "It looks like heaven fell on the ground." I smiled, my throat tight with tears. "Maybe it did," I whispered. "Maybe it finally did." Some truths are too heavy to speak aloud. They live in the silence between heartbeats, waiting, aching, but never finding a voice. Mine has lived there for years, this confession that no one will ever hear, not even from my own lips. Now, as I sit here with gray at my temples and a son who has grown into a man, I realize I have spent most of my life carrying a secret that has shaped every breath I've ever taken. It has been my shadow, my punishment, and, strangely, my salvation. Michael is 22 now. He's kind, thoughtful, and so full of light that people naturally gravitate toward him. He works with children at the local shelter, says it's his calling. Sometimes when I watch him laugh with them, my eyes fill with tears I can't explain. He thinks I'm just sentimental. But I cry because I see God's mercy standing there in front of me, alive, laughing, unknowing. There are moments when I want to tell him, moments when I imagine sitting him down and saying, "You were born of a mistake, but you became my miracle." I imagine his face, the confusion, the hurt, the disbelief. And then I imagine the silence that would follow, the kind that would undo everything I've spent a lifetime building. So I keep quiet. My confession will die with me, not out of cowardice, but out of love. I've thought about writing it down, in a letter perhaps. I've even begun once or twice, but every time I stop before the ink dries. Because what good could come from that truth? What purpose could it serve other than to wound? Michael adores Ed, calls him Dad with pride. And Ed, though older now and slower with age, still loves him with the same fierce devotion he had the day he was born. Watching the two of them together sometimes feels like watching a grace I don't deserve. The kind of peace only heaven could invent to punish and forgive me at the same time. I often wonder what Luis would think if he knew. I heard years ago that he passed away, quietly, unexpectedly. When I learned the news, I locked myself in my room and wept until my body ached. Not for love, not even for regret, but for everything left unspoken between us. He went to his grave never knowing that he had left a piece of himself in this world. A child who carries his eyes and his gentleness. A child who became my reason to live. I sometimes imagine that wherever he is now, he knows that perhaps, from some higher place, he sees what became of our sin, how it turned into something neither of us could have imagined. And maybe, just maybe, he has found the forgiveness I still struggle to accept. Because I've come to understand something with time. Forgiveness isn't always a moment. Sometimes it's a lifetime. Sometimes it's waking up each morning and choosing to believe that you're more than the worst thing you ever did. For years, I sought redemption in silence, by being a good mother, a kind neighbor, a faithful woman. I thought that if I just kept giving, kept loving, kept serving, I could balance the scales of my soul. But God doesn't measure forgiveness in deeds. He measures it in surrender. And surrender is what I resisted for most of my life. Now, in the quiet of my home, with the light of evening spilling through the window, I feel something close to peace. It didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, like dawn after a long night. And it came not because I stopped feeling guilty, but because I finally stopped running from it. I talk to God differently these days. Not as a judge I must beg for mercy, but as a friend who already knows the whole story and still chooses to stay. I tell him the truth now, the truth I could never tell anyone else. I tell him about the rain, the loneliness, the weakness, the love that turned into sin and somehow became grace. I tell him about the fear, the silence, the guilt that became my prayer. And I tell him about my son, the living proof that even from the deepest fall, something divine can still rise. Sometimes when I pray, I can almost feel God smiling, not with approval, but with understanding. Because he knows that I am both sinner and believer, that I fell, but I never stopped seeking his light, even when it burned me. If I could make one confession, not to a priest, not to the world, but to myself, it would be this: I loved wrongly, but I loved with all I had. And maybe, in God's strange mathematics, that still counts for something. I don't know if heaven will open its gates for me when my time comes. Maybe I'll stand outside for a while, waiting for the weight of my silence to lift. But I do know that if grace has any face at all, it looks like my son's. When he visits on Sundays, he still asks me to sing. "Just one song, Mom," he says, smiling. So I do. My voice isn't what it used to be, but he listens like it's a hymn. And as I sing, I feel something holy move through me. Not the purity I once lost, but the peace I found in learning to live with it. I've stopped asking God to erase the past. Now I simply thank him for carrying me through it. Because in the end, the story of my life isn't one of sin, it's one of survival. Of a woman who lost her way, who fell from grace, and yet somehow found her faith again through the laughter of a child she was never meant to have. So this is my confession, the one I could never make aloud. I am not proud of what I did, but I am grateful for what it became. And if that's not redemption, then maybe it's something close enough. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever carried a secret, a regret, or a love that changed the course of your life, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have confessed the truth, or kept it buried like she did? Your reflections matter, not just to this community, but to everyone who's ever searched for redemption in silence. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Another soul's journey through love, guilt, and grace. Until next time, remember, even our deepest mistakes can lead us back to the light.